The photo frame was tilted. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone else, but I saw it. It held a picture of Arthur, taken on our honeymoon in Provence. His laugh caught mid-air, a splash of sunshine on his face. Now it leaned just slightly, a silent question mark in the otherwise perfect order of our mantelpiece. It was a signal, I realized, a whisper in the quiet house that the delicate balance had shifted. My name is Virginia. I'm 68. I live in the house Arthur built for us, nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac where the only constant sound is the distant hum of traffic from the highway, a sound I'd grown to filter out over 5 decades. This house, these objects, they were supposed to be the anchors, the unwavering truths in a world that spun too fast. But a tilted frame, a single thread loose on a carefully mended cushion. These were the fissures, tiny cracks appearing in the familiar landscape of my life. Arthur had been gone for 2 weeks. 2 weeks since the doctors had shaken their heads. 2 weeks since the silence in the house had become a physical presence, pressing in on me from every corner. The funeral was today, a gray, overcast day that mirrored the landscape of my soul. I'd chosen a simple black dress, the same one I'd worn to my mother's funeral, a garment that felt less like mourning and more like a uniform for endurance. My hands, still surprisingly steady for a woman of my age, had smoothed the fabric over my hips, a familiar, almost ritualistic gesture. The air in the house was heavy with the scent of lilies and the lingering faintness of cleaning products. I'd spent the last few days in a quiet, relentless act of preparation, not just for the funeral, but for the future. Every surface gleamed, every book was aligned, every photograph dusted. It was an exercise in control, a way to impose order on the chaos that threatened to overwhelm me. The tilted frame, however, had slipped through my meticulous defenses. I walked over to it, my steps hushed on the polished wooden floor, my fingers gnarled with age but still possessing a surprising dexterity, reached out and straightened it. The click of the frame settling into place was almost imperceptible, yet in the profound quiet of the house, it sounded like a declaration. It was time, not time for grief, not yet. Grief was a tide that would come and go, ebbing and flowing as it pleased. This was something else. This was the slow, steady dawning of a different kind of reckoning. For 50 years, I had built a life, a beautiful, seemingly unblemished life, with Arthur. We had laughter, shared secrets whispered in the dark, the warmth of parallel lives moving in effortless harmony. We had children, grandchildren, a network of friends who filled our holidays with joyous cacophony. From the outside, it was a tapestry woven with golden threads. But every tapestry has its underside, the knots and loose ends hidden from view. And in our tapestry, there had been a knot, a precise, unyielding knot that I had chosen to ignore, to smooth over, to pretend didn't exist. For years I had walked around it, built walls around it, pretended it was simply a part of the fabric, a curious imperfection. But now, with Arthur gone, that knot was exposed, raw, ready to be untangled, or perhaps cut. My gaze drifted to the urn on the small table by the window. Arthur's ashes. A strange, dignified weight, holding the remains of a man who had filled so much space in my world. I had chosen a simple dark wood urn, unadorned, reflecting his quiet strength. I ran my hand over the smooth surface, the wood cool beneath my touch. It was a vessel, nothing more, but it held the echoes of a life lived and the whispers of secrets kept. The doorbell rang, a gentle chime that pulled me from my thoughts. It was Mrs. Henderson, our neighbor, offering her condolences, a plate of lukewarm casseroles in her hands. I smiled, a practiced, serene expression that betrayed nothing of the churning beneath. I accepted the food, exchanged pleasantries, and assured her that I was managing. Managing, yes, but not in the way she imagined. Today was the funeral, a public performance of private grief, a gathering of people who would offer platitudes, share memories, and then return to their own lives, leaving me in this house with the silence and the tilted frames. But today, something else would happen, something quiet, precise. I walked back to the mantelpiece, my eyes lingering on Arthur's smiling face. His eyes in that photo seemed to hold a spark of mischief, a secret understanding. Or perhaps I was projecting. I often did in those moments of profound solitude. I thought of the scarf, the one I had knitted him last winter, a rich, deep burgundy, his favorite color. It was cashmere, soft against the skin, and I had spent weeks on it, each stitch a testament to our shared history, our intertwined lives. He had worn it constantly in the colder months, a vibrant splash of color against his usually muted wardrobe. He'd loved it, often remarking on its warmth, its comfort. That scarf, a symbol of my quiet devotion, would play a part today, a quiet role, like all the best roles, a role that would only be truly understood by one person, and that person would not be Arthur. If this story echoes something buried in you, a quiet like or subscribe helps keep these voices from fading. You don't need to believe me. Just don't look away. The silence in the house, now that Mrs. Henderson had departed, was a living thing. It stretched, deep and resonant, filling every corner, amplifying the smallest sounds. The tick of the antique grandfather clock in the hall, the distant chirping of birds, the gentle rustle of the curtains as a faint breeze stirred. For 50 years this house had been filled with noise. Arthur's booming laugh, the clatter of pots and pans, the boisterous shouts of our children, later softened by the giggles of grandchildren. Now there was only the quiet, a vast echoing space that swallowed every whisper. It was this silence I had tolerated, meticulously constructed around me like a fragile glass wall. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of omission, the silence of unspoken words, of swallowed resentments, of knowing glances exchanged only between my reflection and me. For decades I had been the keeper of Arthur's comfort, the architect of our domestic serenity. My days were a predictable rhythm, tending the garden, baking his favorite lemon loaf, ensuring his shirts were perfectly ironed, orchestrating family gatherings with effortless grace. I was the silent engine, the unseen force that kept the world turning for him. And in that quiet behind the facade of a perfect life, I tolerated her. Not in my house, not directly, but in the periphery. Her presence was a shadow, a faint, persistent ache that never quite went away. She was a woman named Eleanor, a colleague of Arthur's from the university. Younger, vivacious, with a laugh that carried too easily across crowded rooms. I had met her a handful of times at faculty dinners, always maintaining a polite, distant cordiality. My eyes, however, were sharper than she gave them credit for. I saw the way her hand lingered on Arthur's arm a fraction too long, the way her gaze held his for an instant after everyone else had looked away. I saw the subtle shift in Arthur's posture when she entered a room, a subtle tightening, a conscious effort to appear nonchalant. I never confronted Arthur. What would have been the point? A screaming match, tears, accusations. It would have shattered the carefully constructed piece, left jagged edges where there had once been smooth surfaces. And for what? To hear a lie, or worse, a confession that would unravel everything. I chose the silence. I chose to believe that it was merely an indiscretion, a fleeting infatuation, something that would, in time, fade. I chose to preserve the illusion, for our children's sake, for the sake of the life we had so painstakingly built. So I watched. I watched the subtle changes in Arthur's routine, the late nights at the office that became more frequent, the hushed phone calls he would take in the garden, his face turned away from the house. I watched the gifts that appeared, a new tie that wasn't from me, a book by an author he'd never mentioned before. I would touch these objects, a strange mixture of curiosity and quiet dread, and then place them where they belonged, as if by doing so I could sanitize them, absorb them back into the fabric of our home. I knit Arthur that burgundy cashmere scarf 2 winters ago. It was a cold, particularly bleak winter, and he had been complaining about the draft in his office. I remembered every stitch, every evening spent by the fireplace, the needles clicking softly, the yarn flowing through my fingers. Each loop was an act of love, yes, but also an act of defiance, a quiet assertion of my place, my devotion, against the unspoken presence of another. I thought, perhaps, if I poured enough warmth, enough care, into that scarf, it could somehow insulate him, draw him back into the safe, enclosed space of our marriage. He had worn it almost constantly, a rich splash of color against his usual gray suits. He'd often say, "This scarf, Virginia, it feels like a hug." And I would smile, a small, knowing smile, because I understood the layers of that hug. It was not just comfort, it was possession, a mark. I never spoke a word of it, not to Arthur, not to a friend, not even to myself in the darkest hours of the night. The silence became my confidant, my burden, and my strength. It was a cage of my own making, but also a sanctuary where I could observe, process, and wait. I cultivated a serene demeanor, a quiet grace that earned me compliments from friends and family. "Virginia, you're always so calm," they would say, "so strong." They had no idea the strength it took to remain calm in the face of a quiet betrayal, the effort required to maintain that placid surface while a slow fire burned beneath. The silence allowed me to see, to observe the patterns, the subtle tells. It was a long game, played without cards, without a visible opponent, just me and the unacknowledged truth. I learned to read Arthur's moods, not just from his words, but from the slight tension in his shoulders, the fleeting shadow in his eyes. I learned to discern the moments when her name, or a veiled reference to her, might surface in conversation amongst his colleagues, and how quickly he would steer the topic away. I lived in this quiet knowing, a private vigil kept within the walls of my own mind. There were nights I would lie awake, the sound of Arthur's steady breathing beside me, and picture her face, her laugh, her hand on his arm. I would imagine scenarios, confrontations, grand declarations. But always I would return to the silence, because confrontation, I knew, would only serve to release the tension, to dissipate the hidden energy. And I needed that energy. I needed it to build, to simmer, to crystallize into something potent and unyielding. They thought I'd forgotten. I hadn't. I just waited until forgetting was no longer an option. The sunlight, weak and watery, filtered through the shears, casting long shadows across the living room. It was almost time to leave for the funeral home. I looked at the urn again, its dark wood reflecting the muted light, and I thought of the scarf. My scarf. The one knitted with so much unacknowledged pain and quiet determination. It was here, in the house, carefully folded in Arthur's dresser drawer, a relic of a silent battle. It wouldn't stay there for long. The cost. That was the currency I had paid, silently, over decades. It wasn't just the quiet humiliation, the knowledge that a part of Arthur, a significant part, was held by someone else. It was the slow erosion of identity. I had begun as Virginia, a woman with dreams of her own, a quiet ambition to study art history, a desire to travel the world. But slowly, imperceptibly, I became Arthur's wife, the curator of his life, the keeper of his comfort. My own desires were carefully folded away, tucked into the forgotten corners of my mind, like cherished letters never sent. I lost trust, not just in Arthur, though that was a profound and constant ache, a dull throb beneath the surface of every shared meal, every loving gesture. It was a deeper distrust, a cynicism that seeped into my view of the world. If the person closest to you, the one you built your entire life around, could harbor such a secret, then what truth could truly be relied upon? I began to see the subtle betrayals everywhere, in a friend's hurried excuse, in a politician's smooth words, in the unspoken agreements that governed society. It made me guarded, distant, even as I maintained the perfect veneer of approachable warmth. My laughter, once genuine and unrestrained, became a practice sound, a social obligation. My eyes, which once held a lively curiosity, settled into a placid, unreadable gaze. And then there was youth. Not just the physical fading, the lines etching themselves around my eyes, the silver threading through my once dark hair. It was the loss of a certain youthful openness, a boundless optimism that believed in simple narratives, in happy endings. That naive Virginia, the one who believed love conquered all, had slowly, painfully given way to a woman who understood the complexities of silence, the quiet compromises of a life lived. The joy I found in small things, a perfect bloom in the garden, a child's infectious giggle, was often tinged with a quiet melancholy, a sense of what might have been, had the path not diverged, had the silence not been chosen. The betrayal was a persistent background hum, a low-frequency vibration that I learned to live with, to filter out, to integrate into the rhythm of my days. It was like living with a chronic, low-grade fever. You learn to function, to adapt, but the underlying malaise is always there. It affected how I interacted with our children. I loved them fiercely, absolutely, but I became fiercely protective of their innocence, their belief in the sanctity of our family. I shielded them from any hint of discord, creating a fortress of normalcy around them. Perhaps in doing so, I also distanced myself, became less a mother and more a guardian of an illusion. The cost was also in the unlived moments, the roads not taken. There were trips I wanted to take, courses I wanted to enroll in, passions I wanted to pursue. But the mental energy required to maintain the facade, to navigate the intricate unspoken rules of our life, left little room for self-indulgence. My dreams became quiet whispers, easily drowned out by the louder demands of domesticity and the persistent static of unspoken pain. My creativity, once a vibrant outlet, channeled itself into meticulous homemaking, into the quiet perfection of a knitted scarf, into the flawless execution of a dinner party. It was a creative force, yes, but one that had been redirected, contained, prevented from truly blossoming. I often wondered if Arthur knew the toll it took. Did he see the subtle shadows beneath my eyes, the rare moments when my serene smile didn't quite reach them? Did he ever glimpse the deep, still pool of knowledge I carried within me? The quiet knowing that felt like a permanent weight in my chest. I doubted it. He was a man accustomed to being served, to having his world operate seamlessly around him. He saw the beautiful tapestry, not the knotted underside. And I, in my stoic silence, had made it easy for him to remain oblivious. The scarf. It wasn't just a scarf, it was a chronicle of those lost years, those quiet sacrifices. Each stitch was a moment of decision, to stay, to endure, to keep the peace. It was imbued with the countless hours I spent not living my own life, but tending to his, protecting his, even from himself. It was a beautiful, soft, comforting object, yes, but for me, it hummed with the history of its making, a silent testament to a life braided with pain and quiet resilience. As I dressed for the funeral, the black fabric settling around me like a second skin, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The grief for Arthur was real, a sharp, cold pang that would resurface in unexpected moments. But underneath that, a different emotion was stirring, one that had been building for decades, slow and steady like the relentless tide. It was not anger, not a raw, burning rage. It was colder, more precise. It was the calm, steady recognition of a balance that needed to be restored. The scales had been tipped for too long. I reached into Arthur's dresser drawer, my fingers brushing against the familiar softness of the cashmere. The burgundy scarf lay nestled amongst his neatly folded shirts. I pulled it out, feeling its weight, its history, in my hands. It was still imbued with the faintest scent of his cologne, a ghost of his presence. This object, born of my devotion and my silent pain, would now serve a different purpose. It would be an instrument of revelation, a quiet declaration in a room full of carefully composed faces. They thought I'd forgotten. I hadn't. I just waited until forgetting was no longer an option. The weight of it in my hands felt right. A quiet reckoning, long overdue, was about to begin. And the scarf, my scarf, would be its quiet, unmistakable herald. The turning point wasn't a sudden explosion, a dramatic realization under a stormy sky. It was far quieter, more internal, like the precise click of a lock falling into place. It happened a few months before Arthur's diagnosis, in the mundane quiet of a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, meticulously polishing the silver, a task I usually found meditative. Arthur was on the phone in his study, the door ajar. And then I heard it. A different tone in his voice, not hushed as it often was when he was on those calls, but a lightness, an almost giddy laugh I hadn't heard directed at me in years. It was followed by a casual, "Oh, you always know just what to say, Eleanor." That was it. Not a confession, not an argument. Just a careless, almost dismissive phrase, spoken with an ease that suggested a deep intimacy. In that instant, something shifted within me. The carefully maintained silence, the intricate glass wall I had built, began to crack. Not shatter, but crack, allowing a sliver of cold, clear air to seep in. I stopped polishing the silver. My hands, which had moved with such practiced efficiency, stilled. For decades, I had been explaining away his late nights, explaining away the strange gifts, explaining away the faint scent of a different perfume on his clothes. I had explained it to myself, to my anxieties, to the nagging whisper of suspicion. He was busy. He was stressed. He was just being friendly. I had woven a complex narrative of normalcy, of devotion, of mutual respect. But that one careless phrase, "You always know just what to say, Eleanor," demolished it all. It spoke of a bond, a connection, a level of understanding that transcended mere professional acquaintance. It wasn't about sex, it was about something deeper, more insidious, emotional intimacy, a sharing of souls. And in that precise moment, I stopped explaining. I simply knew. There was no rage, no desire to throw things or scream, just a cold, clear recognition. The energy I had spent on building and maintaining the illusion, on suppressing the truth, began to redirect itself. It was as if a powerful current, long held captive, was finally unleashed, flowing in a new direction. I began reclaiming, not with grand gestures, but with small, deliberate acts. I started by looking at Arthur differently. Not with love, though that deep, complicated affection remained, but with a detached observation, as if he were a specimen under a microscope. I noted his habits, his tells, the precise cadence of his lies of omission. I listened not to his words, but to the silences between them, to the things he didn't say. I saw the relief in his eyes when I didn't question his late returns, the easy complacency with which he accepted my quiet efficiency. I started taking longer walks by the lake, alone, not to mourn or to lament, but to simply be, to feel the wind on my face, to listen to the whisper of the reeds, to reconnect with the Virginia who existed before Arthur, before the house, before the silence. I started reading again, not the light fiction I usually consumed, but dense historical biographies, books on strategy, on quiet power. I devoured them, seeking patterns, understanding how the unseen currents moved societies, how individuals wielded influence without fanfare. My reclaiming was also in how I spoke, or rather, how I didn't speak. I became more economical with my words, responding to Arthur with polite affirmation, with neutral phrases that revealed nothing of my inner landscape. I stopped offering unsolicited advice, stopped anticipating his needs before he voiced them. It was a subtle withdrawal, a quiet unbraiding of our intertwined lives. He noticed it, I think, but only vaguely. He would sometimes ask, "Is everything all right, Virginia? You're a little quiet tonight." And I would offer a small, serene smile and say, "Just tired, dear." He accepted it, always. His world was too large, too full of his own concerns, to truly notice the gradual shrinking of mine from his orbit. The diagnosis came like a thunderclap, sudden, brutal, and undeniably final. Pancreatic cancer, aggressive, weeks, perhaps months. The news stunned me, not just with grief for the impending loss, but with a stark realization. The time for reclaiming, for quietly shifting the balance, was now compressed. The long game had become a sprint. In the days that followed, as Arthur weakened, As the house filled with the hushed efficiency of nurses and the somber visits of friends, I continued my quiet work. I sorted through papers, ostensibly organizing his affairs, but in truth, I was piecing together the final puzzle pieces of his double life, not out of anger, but out of a need for complete clarity. I found letters, not passionate declarations, but brief, affectionate notes from Eleanor, tucked away in a ledger of financial documents. They were mundane, almost innocent on the surface, but the underlying current of shared intimacy was undeniable. A shared joke about a difficult colleague, a quiet concern for a mutual friend. They confirmed everything. I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a chilling sense of affirmation. The cost had been real, and the narrative I had woven for myself for so long was now fully unraveled. There was no more explaining, only action. They thought I'd forgotten. I hadn't. I just waited until forgetting was no longer an option. The time was here, and the scarf, my scarf, was waiting. The funeral parlor was a study in hushed solemnity, a muted palette of gray suits and black dresses, punctuated by the faint scent of lilies and sorrow. Every face I saw was a reflection of practiced grief, a respectful distance maintained. Our children, bless them, sat in the front row beside me, their faces etched with genuine sorrow, their hands occasionally reaching for mine in silent comfort. I offered them small, reassuring squeezes, a quiet strength that belied the meticulous choreography unfolding in my mind. The service began. Soft music, a eulogy delivered by Arthur's oldest friend, filled the air. My gaze remained fixed on the urn, positioned precisely on a small draped table at the front of the room. It was dark, simple, containing the last tangible remnants of a man who had been both my anchor and my quiet adversary. I had arrived early, as always, ensuring everything was exactly as it should be. The flowers, the seating, the delicate balance of public mourning. I had carried the burgundy scarf, my scarf, in my large black handbag. It was folded neatly, its softness a strange counterpoint to the steely resolve hardening within me. The eulogy continued, weaving a narrative of Arthur's life, his academic achievements, his love for his family, his quiet generosity. It was a carefully curated story, a public legacy crafted from half-truths and selective memory. And then, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. A ripple, almost imperceptible, passed through the back rows of the room. The door at the rear of the parlor opened, not with a creak, but with a soft sigh of hydraulics. Heads turned discreetly, then a little less so. Eleanor. She arrived late, of course, always with an entrance, even a somber one. My gaze didn't waver from the urn, but I felt her presence, a sudden chill in the air despite the warmth of the crowded room. My senses, honed by decades of quiet observation, registered every detail: the rustle of her silk dress, the faint scent of her expensive perfume, distinct from the lilies, and then the sight that made a cold certainty bloom in my chest. She was wearing the scarf, my burgundy cashmere scarf, knitted with my own hands, woven with my quiet pain and my silent defiance. It was draped artlessly around her neck, a vibrant, jarring splash of color against her conservative black dress. A casual theft, a careless display, a final, undeniable claim. A flicker of heat, not anger, but a profound sense of clarity coursed through me. This was not a coincidence. This was a deliberate act, a flag planted on the field of my grief. She was announcing her presence, her claim in the most audacious way possible. In that moment, 100 unsaid words, 1,000 swallowed tears coalesced into a single sharp purpose. The eulogist was finishing, his voice softening. This was my window. This was the precise surgical moment. I reached into my handbag, my movement smooth, unhurried. My fingers closed around the soft, familiar cashmere. I withdrew it, unfolding it with a quiet precision. The room was still, everyone absorbed in the final words of remembrance. No one noticed my movements in the front row. As the eulogist concluded and the first notes of a quiet hymn began to play, I rose. My children, startled, looked at me with questioning eyes. I offered them a small, reassuring nod, a silent promise that I was simply doing what needed to be done. My steps were slow, deliberate, each footfall a quiet punctuation mark on the polished floor. I walked to the table where Arthur's urn rested. Eleanor, I sensed, was still making her way through the rows, her late arrival drawing discreet glances. She would be just reaching the middle, where she could see. I stood before the urn, my back mostly to the room, my movements shielded by the dignity of the moment. My hands, steady and unhesitating, took the scarf. I raised it slowly, deliberately, allowing the rich burgundy fabric to unfurl. And then, with an almost tender gesture, I began to tie it. Not around my neck, not around my wrist. I tied it around the base of Arthur's urn. It was a simple knot, a gentle embrace of the vessel. The cashmere, so soft and yielding, settled around the dark wood, a vibrant splash of color, unmistakable and undeniable. It was a declaration, quiet but absolute, a boundary drawn, a claim reclaimed. I could feel Eleanor's eyes on my back. I didn't need to see her to know. I felt the sudden, arrested stillness that rippled through the room as others, too, began to notice the small, silent act. The eulogy was over. The hymn was playing, and the air was thick with unspoken questions. I turned then, slowly, my gaze sweeping across the faces in the room. My eyes met hers. She was standing in the aisle, frozen, the scarf I had knitted her, the one she had so brazenly worn, a stark contrast to the one now tied around Arthur's urn. For a fraction of a second, the carefully composed mask on her face fractured. Her eyes widened, a flicker of bewildered understanding, then a flash of something akin to fear. Not anger, not defiance. Fear. She knew. She saw the scarf around the urn, and she saw the quiet, knowing look in my eyes. She realized, in that moment, that I had known all along, that her casual display had not gone unnoticed, but had instead been met with a deliberate, public, yet entirely silent act of repossession. They thought I'd forgotten. I hadn't. I just waited until forgetting was no longer an option. The silence in the room stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. She had arrived late wearing my scarf. I had tied it around Arthur's urn before she could speak. The act was done. The reckoning had begun. The breath I took after tying the scarf around the urn was the deepest I'd taken in decades. It wasn't a gasp or a shudder, but a slow, deliberate intake of air that felt like a quiet expulsion of years of suppressed emotion. There was no shaking, no visible tremor in my hands or voice, just a profound, unwavering stillness. The air in the room, thick with the scent of lilies and the unspoken question marks that hung between us, felt strangely clear, as if a long-held tension had finally, subtly snapped. Eleanor remained frozen in the aisle, her face a canvas of disbelief, then a dawning comprehension, and finally a subtle, almost imperceptible flinch. It was the slightest movement, a tightening around her eyes, a minute drawing back of her shoulders. But I saw it. I had been watching for it, waiting for it for years. It was the precise moment the weight of knowing transferred, the quiet realization that her secret, her casual disregard had been seen, understood, and now irrevocably marked. She knew that I knew. And in that knowing, a cold, quiet fear bloomed in her eyes. It was not the fear of exposure, not yet, but the chilling realization that she was no longer dealing with the placid, unsuspecting wife. She was dealing with a woman who had observed, endured, and finally acted with a surgical precision she could never have anticipated. My gaze drifted from her face, sweeping across the rows of mourners. My children looked at me, bewildered, but in their eyes I saw not condemnation, but a nascent curiosity, a sudden awareness that there was more to their mother than they had ever truly understood. Friends shifted uncomfortably, their polite expressions morphing into something more inquisitive. No one spoke. The hymn played on, a gentle, melancholic backdrop to the silent drama. I didn't offer an explanation. There was no need. The scarf, tied securely around the urn, spoke volumes. It was a private message, delivered in a public space, understood only by the intended recipient, yet undeniably visible to all. It was a reclaiming of what was mine, not just the physical object, but the narrative, the truth that had been buried under layers of polite silence. The rest of the funeral service passed in a blur of practiced rituals. People came forward to offer condolences, their words hushed, their eyes occasionally flickering to the burgundy scarf on the urn. I met their gazes with serene composure, offering quiet thanks. Eleanor, I noticed, did not approach. She stayed in the back, eventually slipping out before the procession to the gravesite, a shadow retreating into the gray afternoon. Her exit was as quiet as her entrance had been conspicuous. Later, at the graveside, under the somber sky, Arthur was lowered into the earth. The scarf remained on the urn, a vibrant testament against the stark black and gray of the coffin and the damp earth. It was still there when the last shovel of dirt had been placed, a final, unmoving presence. The release I felt was not an explosion of joy, nor a cathartic sob. It was quieter, deeper. It was the sensation of a burden lifted, a knot untied. There was no forgiveness in my heart. Forgiveness would imply a desire for reconciliation, a letting go of the truth. And I had waited too long, paid too high a cost to let the truth fade. Instead, there was balance, a sense that the scales so long tipped had finally settled back into equilibrium. My silence, once a cage, was now a shield, impenetrable and strong. The quiet fury that had simmered for decades had not burned the world down. It had simply forged a single precise instrument, and with it I had made sure that the people who once owned my quiet world, who had believed in their unchallenged impunity, would now look over their shoulder and find my shadow already there. They never knew what I did, and I never told them. They still smile in public, but I know who taught them to flinch, and for once, no one filled the silence.